Hello and welcome to the weekly voice chat of Men Are Human. We are the semi-official Discord of the men's rights subreddit. And today we are going to be talking about this article here. If you are looking at the text channel, 37 questions to prove that systemic misandry doesn't exist anywhere. And I have to tell you, this is one of the most ridiculously, ludicrously stupid, ridiculously nonsensical articles I've ever read in my entire life. It's nothing but whataboutism. It's completely illogical. It makes absolutely no sense. And it's really kind of infuriating. And let's talk a little bit, first of all, about the author who wrote this article. There's a lot to talk about here. I'm going to post her Wikipedia page now. You're going to see it, and then I'm going to post a few screenshots of her article. Jessica Taylor is a doctor. She has a doctorate, and that to me is striking because she got a PhD. And not only does she have a PhD, but as you'll see in a minute, she was a professor. And this was the subject you talked about. Now, I will say, it does say that she was a victim of sexual assault. And I understand why that's horrible, and I understand why this is a very emotional topic for her. But if I'm going to be real, just because you go through a traumatic experience doesn't mean you get to lie and dismiss other people's issues. It doesn't mean that you get to claim monopoly over victimhood. And she is a genuine victim. I will acknowledge that she is a genuine victim. But she is hurting other victims by kind of erasing their reality and just sort of woman-splaining right over them. So let's take a look at this over here. This is her academic history. So you'll see this is where she was a PhD and where she was a professor. And you'll see that she was a senior professor in criminal and forensic psychology. And that's an important thing to keep in mind when we go forward and look at this article. So that's that. Keep in mind, she is a PhD. She won awards from feminist groups. She teaches, or she taught, psychology, criminal psychology. And she was a member of the feminist groups who pushed for the 2020 gendered domestic violence bill. But okay, so let's get into this 37 questions that prove systemic misandry doesn't exist. And I guess we can just kind of go through it one by one. I'm going to take a screenshot of the first 8. Okay, so here's a screenshot of the first 8. Let's take a look at what this says. Number 1, can you name one instance of an all-female terrorist regime that has committed acts of mass rape and murder towards boys and men who they deem inferior? Number 2, can you name one instance where a group of female terrorists abducted hundreds of little boys from their school to traffic them for sex? Okay, so let's stop right there. So basically, the angle she's going for is that when bad things happen to women, it's happening because of men. And when bad things happen to men, it's still happening because of men. It's not women doing it, it's men doing it. So I might use the example of Boko Haram kidnapping those boys and killing them and how the media ignored it. And she would say, oh, but it was men doing it. And I might point to the Scorpion gang during the Bosnian massacre, Sabrinica, where they massacred 8,000 boys and men. And she would say, oh, but it was men doing it. But first of all, I mean, the stupidity of that argument. First of all, do you think the boys who were kidnapped and murdered care that it's a man doing it? Like, does that make them feel any better? Like, if you're tortured or kidnapped or executed, you don't think, oh, well, this is okay because a man is doing it. So therefore, this is fine. And the misandry is how, not just who the perpetrator is, the misandry is how does society and the media as a whole react to it. Misandry about Boko Haram was when media completely ignored the boys who were kidnapped and only focused on the girls who were kidnapped. And I have a feeling that Dr. Taylor would be one of the people who would probably say, oh, that's just a what about the men argument. But no, it's not. Bringing up people who are experiencing an issue and are being ignored is not a whataboutism. It's a perfectly valid point to make. And the second part is none of this disproves that misandry exists. Saying this issue over here exists, and that's perfectly valid. It's absolutely true that sexual assault is a problem, that misogyny is a problem, that in many countries women are oppressed. We don't deny that. What she's saying is that because those things exist, therefore misandry doesn't exist. But that doesn't make sense. Just because these issues exist and affect women, which is true, doesn't mean that conscription doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that homeless men aren't ignored. It doesn't mean that circumcision doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that higher pension age for men doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that when male victims of domestic violence call the police, they're not taken less seriously. It doesn't change any of that. It's irrelevant. It's like you wouldn't imagine if someone started a campaign in their town, an anti-littering campaign, to kind of pick up trash and pick up garbage on the streets and throw it away to make things a little bit cleaner in their town. That's a good cause, right? You wouldn't go up to that person and say, excuse me, what you're doing is wrong because genocide exists and genocide is worse. Obviously, genocide is worse, but that doesn't mean that it's a bad thing to start a campaign to pick up littering and pick up trash. And especially when you're talking about a lot of the male issues we're talking about are just as bad as these issues. For example, Boko Haram, kidnapping, murdering boys. ISIS, murdering men and boys. Al-Qaeda, murdering men and boys. Even if you go to those third world countries, these things are still happening to men and boys. And yes, I acknowledge there are some specific women's issues. We do not deny that. We do not deny that. But using this list as an example of how misandry against men isn't real doesn't make any sense. Just because one thing is bad doesn't negate something else. So let's keep going. Number 3, can you name one female-led country in the world where it is illegal for men to drive a car or having a driver's license because they are perceived as too stupid? Once again, what does that have to do with any man's issue? How does that disprove misandry in any way, shape, or form? Yes, that's a problem that exists. Yes, it's a problem that exists in Saudi Arabia. I agree. That's a bad thing. I am 100% in agreement.
Hey, could I stop you right there and just mention that there is a feminist country where men are drafted based on a vote that women were allowed to take part in, and there's a feminist country where they rearranged the way the streets were snow plowed to prioritize women. And
I believe you're talking about Finland and Germany, right?
Yeah,
Lithuania. The draft, yeah.
I think that I'm talking about actually Norway, but I can't remember the names of the countries. But I do know Sweden was one of the feminist snowplows, and I should also mention that we came across a while ago like a female-led country where they tried to make it illegal for men to pee standing up in public toilets.
Yeah, Finland has the female-led government that has male-only conscription. I believe it's either Lithuania or Estonia, but it might be Latvia. I always get those 3 confused, but I do think it's Lithuania. It has a female PM or president or whatever they call it, and male-only conscription, which they actually expanded in 2019. So yes, there are in fact, I made a video about that, how Finland technically has a female-led government controlling male bodies because conscription is controlling someone's physical body. But let's get back. Go on.
And do you know if they have gender-neutral rape and domestic violence laws? Because I know for a fact there are multiple countries where male governments have been harangued into making sure that the definition is gendered by female activists, powerful women, and so on. The UK is one, India, Palestine.
Not only is the UK one, but Dr. Jessica Taylor, who we're talking about right now, was literally one of the key voices of that conversation, pushing for that. So the professor and lecturer who talks about domestic violence and won an award from feminist groups is one of the people who was pushing for a gender domestic violence law. I can only imagine what she was teaching her students. So, but let's get back to the list. We were just at number 3. It seems like she decided not to do number 4. So now we're just going to number 5 for whatever reason. Can you name one female-led country in the world where men are not allowed to leave their houses without a female chaperone? The answer is no, but how does that prove that misandry doesn't exist? That just proves that, yes, women's rights are an issue. We don't disagree that misogyny exists in the world. We know misogyny exists in the world. We don't ever deny that. What we're saying is that doesn't, the fact that there are countries where women can't leave without a chaperone is true and is a valid issue, but that doesn't disprove misandry. It's like, you wouldn't say, well, the Holocaust is evidence that global warming doesn't exist, or the Holocaust is evidence that the Titanic didn't happen. There's no logic there. Like, it just makes no sense.
Another thing to bring up is that India actually had a city. I think it was, I'm not sure if we confirmed this or not. There was some dispute about it, but there was articles about how women were allowed to leave their houses for an hour a day or a week or something
No.
during a COVID lockdown.
Yeah, I did a video on this. It was India. It was 3 hours a day. It was from 1 to 4 p.m. The government did a total lockdown for 21 days. But you were allowed to leave for food, to buy food, but only women, 1 to 4. So if you were a man and you lived in a home without a woman living in that home, and you went without food for 21 days, if you went outside, the police beat you.
Yeah, I'd be pretty screwed, to be honest. There's no women in this household.
Okay, so let's keep going down the list. Number 6, well, number 5, but number 6. Can you name one country in the world where females in power have legally dictated that men should cover their entire bodies at all times, not show their hair or faces, and punish men and boys who do show their skin? No, I can't. And that happens to women in some countries, and that's a problem. I agree. That's bad. That shouldn't happen. But once again, I'm just going to make the same point 37 times because it's the same point 37 times. That fact does not mean misandry isn't real. Just because that problem exists in some countries doesn't mean that misandry doesn't exist. And notice, keep in mind what we said before. She said it proves that misandry, systemic discrimination of men, doesn't exist anywhere. How does that make any sense? Let's go to number 7. Can you name one female-led country or community in the world that has legally banned boys from getting an education or attending school? Maybe not, but I can list many, many countries where boys are failing in school, more likely, more often, where boys are less likely to graduate, where boys are falling behind in school, where boys have less scholarships, where boys get lower grades for the same work, where boys are less likely to go to college. I can name a lot of countries like that. I can name countries where only boys get canes, but girls don't, such as Singapore. So how does the exist?
Blue, did you stop talking?
Oh, hi. Sorry, I hit mute. What's the last thing you heard me say?
I kind of got lost with it as well.
Okay.
Just repeat the last sentence or two.
Okay, I'll recap. So basically, she says that, can you name any female-led country in the world that has legally banned boys from getting education or attending school? And I said no, but I can list countries that have boys going to college at lower rates, boys getting worse grades, boys getting lower grades for the same work, boys having less scholarships, boys falling behind in education, boys being a minority in university. So I can name a lot of countries where boys are faring worse in education. And yes, it is true that there are some countries where girls have restriction in education, and that's a perfectly valid point, but it doesn't mean the education gap against boys doesn't exist. Laura, you just said the Middle East under Taliban law restricts boys from going to school too. So there you go. I mean, it's this whole article, these 37 questions are just so narrow-minded. It's just so narrow-minded. I mean, it's basically saying, well, because cancer exists, heart attacks aren't real. Is the logic? It's the equal logic to what you're saying. Okay,
And we
number
have
8.
to also, before you on, we have to also recognize that she, in the top of her list, says that counterexamples debunk her point. If I'm reading this rightly, she has this thing saying the reasons for these questions are twofold. One, you probably can't give real evidence-based examples for all or most or any of these, because misandry doesn't and never has existed in the patriarchy where men rule the world. Two, if you did find one example, all you found is an exception, which makes her argument basically irrefutable, because if you give her an example, it's just an exception. But the thing is that she's framed these questions the way that, well, basically, do you know about how a lot of shops will do a skeevy, if you can find this somewhere cheaper, we'll give you it at that price. But then they go to the manufacturers and they specifically ask for unique model numbers to be put onto generic mattresses that they then sell, so you can't actually compare them. That's basically what she's doing. She's wording the questions in such a way that you can't actually do anything but agree with the question. But the problem is that the question doesn't actually, if you read her first part where she's talking about evidence-based examples, we can give evidence-based examples of misandry all day long, but she's basically trying to trap you to the point where you can't give them, because you as long as she's in control and she has the power to force you to use her list, there's absolutely nothing you can do as long as you accept the list. But if you don't accept that these questions have to be worded exactly the way she words them, everything changes. So let's take number 1, actually. Can you name one instance of all female terror? Well, what number are we up to, actually? 7?
I'm just going to kind of skip around. I actually want to kind of highlight a point that I made earlier. I just posted to the discussion channel. This is point 17. Can you name one country where the majority of all murders of men are committed by women? I know what she's talking about. She's talking about the femicide myth in Central and South America, where, of course, 90% of murders are male, 90% of murder victims are male. And here again, she's trying to frame it. Notice what her point is. Her point is not, can you name a country where the majority of murder victims are male? Notice how she can't make that point because she knows it's not true. So instead, she says something, she twists it. She says, can you name one country where the majority of all murders of men are committed by women? As if like, oh, that how makes it, not so bad because they're just being killed by other men. So, okay, that's not really. Do you think a murder victim or the family of the murder victim cares what gender the murderer was? Oh, my son was murdered last week. Oh, that's so sad. Oh, no, it's okay. He was killed by another man. Therefore, it's not
Can
really.
I add a point there?
Sure. Oh, by the way, actually, no. Wait, Kate, because I have something here that is actually quite relevant to what we talked about last week. So let me actually, before you say anything, I think you might like this next one. I'm going to jump to number 22, and okay, let's look at number 22. It's not exactly what happens in Kenya, but it's kind of close. Can you name one country where large groups of women publicly flog and beat men as a form of punishment for being seen out alone without a female chaperone? Now, you were talking about how domestic violence in Kenya works a lot of times, where women will punish men and they will physically beat men as a punishment. Now, it's not exactly the same as being seen out alone without a female chaperone. I will acknowledge that. But yeah, I actually can name a country where women will publicly flog men as punishment. Kenya.
Sorry, carry on.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I just wanted to add the point that there is still misandry when a man kills another man, and I'll tell you why. In prison culture, they have this I don't know to call it concept, or they have this bias against men who have beat women, or men who have killed women, they like view them the same way they view like child murderers or child rapists. I don't know if you guys understand a bit what I'm talking about, but like in prison culture, like they view specific criminals as worse. And I'm not talking about the wardens or anything. I'm talking about the actual inmates themselves. So like for example, someone who is like a child murderer or a child rapist is going to get like ostracized on the prison block because they've done something that's like really reprehensible, right? And they have the same type of mentality when it comes to people who've, or rather men who have killed women or men who have beaten women and gone to jail for that. They view them as weak, they view them as basically worse than someone who's done the same thing to a man. They won't even react differently if you've done the same thing to a man, but they'll act differently if you've done it to a woman, right? So there is, it's not necessarily that a crime has to be committed by a woman for it to be considered sexist, like, and plus she's completely ignoring the fact that it's entirely possible for a woman to hire a hitman or like basically another man to go beat up um, another man or to kill him. In Kenya, there was a case like that where there was this man who was married to an abusive woman. And after she left him, sometimes she would hire like other men to go beat him up and steal his things. So it's not like it doesn't happen at all. It's just that when it's done that way, it's like less harder to how do I say, it's like less harder to count because like technically it's done by another man, but like they were hired by a woman, you know what I mean? So yeah.
Well, okay, first, I don't think that. So this discussion is mostly around systemic forms of misandry, right? Now, I don't really think it's comparable to compare social and cultural misandry to systemic, because a lot of things have to come from the top down. So like, I don't think prison culture is really like the same conversation as things that you can see that are put into actual law that affects people from the top down. But then another point that I did want to add about what Blue Orange was saying is like as bad as her argument is, I don't think her point about saying it's men who's doing these acts against other men is to say that it matters less. Her point is to say that men are more prone to violence compared to women, not that the actions of their violence matter less. It's that men are more likely to enact and perpetrate violence.
But like my confusion
Well, hang
comes
on,
in.
really fast, Kate. Really fast, Kate. Let me just kind of jump in there, and then
Okay.
I actually have to kind of go soon. But I'm going to answer what Athena just said. I'm going to partially agree, and I'm going to partially disagree. First of all, I would say some of these cultural and societal gender roles result in some of the discriminatory laws. So the way that the UK, for example, they now legally have a distinct justice system for men and women is because of these gender norms. So I would disagree that there's this sharp distinction between the two. I think one kind of leads to the other. Second point, when you say is that men are more prone to violence, it would be dishonest for me to disagree with that. So I'm not going to disagree with that. But I'm going to point out, I'm going to kind of quote Aaron Strong. In fact, let me link her video. I'm going to point to the theory of male disposability, where our social standards and our gender norms, while it encourages men to be violent more often, it also puts men in the line of fire more often. And violence becomes a man's responsibility, even when he doesn't want it. So, for example, when there's a war and there's a draft or conscription, or if someone breaks into your house, or someone starts a fight in a bar, it is men who are expected to engage in violence, even if they don't want to. And I'm going to quote, I'm going to link Karen Strong's video right now. I want to watch it now, I would recommend at least saving it because it's very good. Anyway, sorry,
Well,
Kate.
so I wasn't necessarily saying that. I wasn't making the argument that I believe men are X, Y, and Z. I was just saying that the person who wrote the article was saying that because that was her assertion, more so than like
Right.
my personal thing. And then about the systemic thing, I was just, although I do think it's correlated, I do think it's kind of a different conversation than the one that she's trying to make, as flawed as her arguments are, because I do think it trickles from the top down. And when you look at systemic oppression, it's like kind of like what I was talking about with Laura the other day. Like, a lot of the things come from a legal level and then they trickle down into a social level. So I think that happens more than the inverse.
Interesting. Do you want to expand? I'm not totally sure I agree, but that is interesting. Do you want to maybe expand on that a little bit?
Right. So, like, for example, if you look at other oppressed groups, right? Like gay marriage, for example, that was legalized. And once it became legalized and people were doing it more often, it was easier for like people in culture to like move towards being open to that idea more so than before it was legal. So I feel like when things are done on a legal level, that kind of sets the tone for how people will adapt to it and respond to it on a cultural level.
Okay. Okay. Well, Athena, I don't know if you just saw the text I just made in the voice discussion. I do have to kind of go soon. It's for work, but this is so far a really good chat, and I would like to thank you and everyone else for participating and making it great. I have a feeling I'm going to be missing out on a lot of good stuff because I think this is going to be a long one. Wow, I know a lot of people have stuff to say. So yeah, definitely. Thank you. I think Kate, you wanted to go next, and then after that, I'm gonna come. Well, I'm gonna leave anyway, but I'd really like to hear from all you guys. So if you're someone that doesn't really talk a lot or hasn't really talked yet, type yourself in the voice discussion so we can see you. And by all means, this is an open chat. We want to hear from you, and yeah.
Yeah, just to go back to like question 11, it's quite interesting that they use the wording, can you name one country where 1 in 3 men will be raped or sexually assaulted by a woman? Because I actually can, the USA. You see, there's a study on our citations list that suggests that 40% of all young men have some sort of experience with being forced into sex. I think it was 40%. It might have been 50%. I can get it up actually.
The thing is, first of all, like, let me just make 2 quick comments about this entire list in general. First, some of these questions that she's written, they're not even examples of systemic misogyny. Like, for example, when we talk about women being killed by men, yes, it's disgusting and horrible, but no government is pro men killing women, like not one of them. Second of all, she specifically says this proves that there's no systemic misandry in the world, right? So it doesn't make sense for her to compare crimes done by random men to saying that there's no systemic misandry. There's no correlation there. And second of all, this is like one of the biggest examples of false dichotomies that I've ever seen in my life. That just because this is happening doesn't mean that another thing can't happen, or something like that. It's just pretty bad, this whole list. And then when it comes to some individual comments, yeah, women do rape men, unfortunately. Women do rape a man, they rape their husbands, they rape their boyfriends, and it happens. And also, yeah, men raping other men sexually assaulting other men. Now, where the systemic misandry comes in that specific question is not that men rape other men or that women rape men. The systemic misandry comes in when you realize that male victims of rape rarely get any help. In a lot of countries, like I said, systemically, in a lot of countries, it doesn't even say that men can be raped. Like India, it doesn't even say that women are capable of raping men in the law books, right? Second of all,
hang on. Do you know why it says that? Because we talked about this before. Do you know why it doesn't say that in the law books? Because in 2013, that exact issue in India came up about how rape laws didn't protect men. And the Indian government was going to change it. They were going to actually change the laws to protect men as well. But they didn't, because feminist groups came out. I'm going to link this one because this is feminist groups came out and actually protested and said that men cannot legally be raped. So if anyone says that feminism has never hurt men, you can use this link, which I'm going to show you in a second, that in India, the reason why men are not protected from rape, and Indian males are 10% of the world's population, if you do the math, 10% of the world's population are not protected from sexual assault under law directly and only because of feminist groups lobbying. Let me get that link.
yeah, as you're getting the link,
I would like to add something to that. I would like to add something to what Blue said. There was a particular feminist that even protested of including young boys in the protect a bill that protects children from sexual abuse and abuse in general. Feminists legit protested against adding boys into that bill. I mean, that's like lowest of the low. I mean, it's completely destroys the myth of uh, what's best for the children.
damn, I'm really shocked about that. But okay, basically the point that I wanted to add is that there's a very good researcher. Her name is Stample, or Laura Stample, and she researches specifically about the sexual abuse and rape of men and boys, right? So she's covered everything from wartime rape, which happens a lot, and rape of men in prisons, right? So what she found is that in a lot of detention centers, in a lot of places where they keep men as prisoners of war, the vast majority of the inmates there, all men, have been raped. A majority of them, right? And yeah, it's true that a lot of the time they're raped by other men. Sometimes they're raped by female guards, but a lot of the time they're raped by other men. But the issue is that there are a lot of organizations that actually know that this is going on, and they're ignoring it. Like she found she when she was researching this issue, she found out that out of all the organizations around the world, out of all the charities, out of all the non-governmental organizations, out of all of them that recognize rape as a weapon of war, less than 3% offered services to men who had been raped, right? That's number one, right? That men don't receive any help or receive very little help when they are raped. That's number one. Number two is that in Africa, where some of these issues occur, and in the Middle East, homosexuality is illegal, right? So if you're raped as a man and you're raped by another man, you try and report him, you go to prison or you get killed, I'm not even joking. That's something that's actually happened in some Middle Eastern countries, that boys as young as 14 were literally executed for being raped. This is disgusting and it shouldn't happen, but it is an example of systemic misandry that neither governments nor charitable organizations want to accept, that men can be victims of rape, even if it's by other men. It does. I'm really thinking that there's no male domestic violence victim or male rape victim who's thinking to himself, wow, golly gee whiz, I've been raped to the point where I'm considering suicide, but at least it wasn't by a woman. No one's thinking that. So like, yeah, I'm sorry, like this kind of made me a little bit upset, but yeah.
Yeah, it's really kind of awful that she's actually like sitting there typing out this list of things that, like, problems that women have. Some of them real, some of them a bit less so. And then expecting us, just sort of sitting back and it's saying, ha, gotcha. Misandry doesn't exist because there are examples of misogyny. But every single example on her list could be correct. And we could still have like even worse misandry. I've got a couple of questions for her. Name one genocide that specifically targets women instead of men. Most of them target men.
Technically, the female infanticide in China would be one example.
Well, she's a feminist, so I'm assuming she's pro-abortion, and the infanticide is mostly abortions. So
no, it was definitely a lot of live babies being killed because of the one-child policy and the way that females were viewed in society. That's why China has a lot of problems extending out from that, where they have so few women relative to men that the standards for what men have to, like the baseline for what men have to offer just to get a single woman is so high because the gender ratios are so thrown off because of that time period.
That is a fair point, although it's worth noting that the entire reason that the families want a male child instead of a female child is that a male child can go out and work and support them in their old age, whereas a female child...
That, but also to carry on the family name, because female children, your family name dies with your daughter because they adopt the last name of whoever they marry. So to carry on the traditions of your family, you would need to have a son because it would carry on the family name, and you couldn't afford to have a single daughter and then your family line is just, gone.
Can I just say a quick word here?
Yep.
Go on.
So if you guys want, I can link you to a survey that actually showed that male fathers, okay, sorry, that's redundant, fathers in India, where there's also like some infanticide of babies, of female babies, they were actually less likely to say that they wanted a boy than the mothers were, right? And this is not because mothers hate girls or anything. It's just because in India, first of all, there's a very high rate of poverty, right? So they'd rather have mothers would rather have a son who can support their family and do child labor. Like there's a lot of male child laborers in India, right? Rather than a girl who can't really do that much child labor. And then there's also the dowry system, which means that they're going to have to support the girl until she gets married and then pay a dowry before she gets married, right? So that's how it is in India, right? So here's the thing. It's when you look at the way she's framing her questions, she always says, oh, if it's done by a man, it's not misandry, So you could also argue by using her logic, if it's done by a woman, it's not misogyny, right? And a lot of mothers there, they are not being forced, they're doing it out of their own accord, not because they're misogynists, but actually because it's that issue of poverty and child work, right? I was looking at an interview of a mother who did this. She killed her own female child, and she was asked, why did you do it? There was nothing about misogyny there. There was nothing about girls being less human beings, according to her. What she was saying is, it was actually quite sad. She was saying, I grew up in poverty as a girl, and I didn't want my daughter to go through that. I'd rather have a son who might bring me out of poverty, and that kind of thing. So it's really depressing and it's really sad, but to frame it as something that's just misogyny it just doesn't make any sense. That's like saying like when a father does something to his son, that could be an example of misandry. And yes, it could, but not according to her logic. I remember during the I don't know what's the name of this massacre, the Sabrinica Massacre, if I'm not wrong. They literally killed male infants, by the thousands. They were literally taking male infants and then stabbing them. It was disgusting. And the UN actually knew this was going to happen before it did, and they didn't do anything to stop the slaughter of male babies, but they put women and children, or rather women and female children, on buses, and they removed them, and this is the UN. This is not some poor impoverished mother in India. This is the UN, doing this. So again, like, obviously, of course, I'm not pro like female infanticide, but what you guys need to understand is that both female infanticide and in China and in India affects less than 2% of the population. And I was comparing the statistics of people in India, of life satisfaction, of lifespan, of even of education. And girls are doing better than boys, and women are doing better than men in almost everything, So chances are, if you're a girl born in India, if you're part of the most girls in India, apart from the poorest 2%, you're going to live, a comfortable life, at least more comfortable than your brothers,
Okay, so
So,
multiple points. Firstly, he asked for an example of a genocide where females were the target, and I just used China as one example. That's not to say anything other than that's one example of females being the target of genocide. That's not to say who's enacting it, who's promoting it, if it's misogyny, if it's misandry. All of those things were added by other people after the fact. None of those things were my argument. I just provided one example. The second thing is, of course, now that that period has ended, women are going in those societies are going to be huge beneficiaries, because if you think of it, like, every single person who exists for the most part wants to have connection, wants to have relationship, wants to have at least maybe an opportunity to grow a family. Not all people, but most people desire companionship. And when you have a society that's disproportionate male to female ratios like that, the female's market value is driven into the stratosphere because they're so rare. So obviously they're going to have a bunch of opportunities and a bunch of men doing everything they can to get one. Men in China, like, sick people who have their lives together, have jobs, have cars, still can't find even one woman because the ratios are so fucked up. They have to travel and do sex tourism and pick up women all over Southeast Asia and all these poorer countries, ship women in from North Korea. Like, it's this whole thing now because that's a side effect of the genocide that happened generations prior. So, like, yeah, women are definitely benefiting in that culture now because of the mistakes of the past.
Well, that's very interesting. I should mention that, like I said before, having a counterexample to what I was saying doesn't really invalidate like the majority of cases, and it shouldn't be taken as invalidating the existence of misandry. Likewise, the existence of misogyny isn't invalidated by me coming up with an example of misandry. So, I just want to be like super clear on that. It's like, this isn't the gender war that she wants it to be, or at least it shouldn't be a gender war. Zayda, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I would just like to add something about dowry here. So basically, dowry also usually greatly benefit women too. In many cases, uh, Indian society in general, most communities are both endogamic and exogamic. So they have very limited amount of dating pool or marriage pool. So in that marriage pool, very limited amount of men are successful, rich, handsome, and tall. So to get for people, for women to get like the best option, what they do is there's the culture over there that they bid on the guy. Like some like dowry, I think mostly exists because of this reason. Like they wanna like bid on the guy. If someone is saying, "Oh, marry your son to my daughter, I will pay amount 1,000,000 rupees," and the other one will like, "No, I will pay 1.2 million rupees to you in as a gift for dowry." So like this is that also happens. Plus, I would like to also add on here that in India there are quite a lot of gender gap gender gap here. Uh, like there are more men than there are women, but men die really often. So it can also be a reason that it get even out in most cases.
I'm not really understanding how a dowry is being used as an example of like misandry, because like isn't that literally selling your child to marriage because of money? Like how is that used as the example of misandry? That like that's weird. Like I don't understand that.
Because it's the
Like the
opposite
girl's side of the
in
family is
India.
the one. I mean, the girls. I mean, like the girl's side of the family is the one that pays the dowry. So like
Yeah,
the guy is the product here, and
yeah. So like
also
I'm also
like the
Indian. So like yeah, sorry, continue.
so and also like dowry is generally the girl's inheritance. In most cases, the Indians really do not have liquidated assets. It's mostly the wealth is mostly uh, in the form of either gold jewelry or ancestral property or businesses, especially for the middle class or the poor. So the girl's dowry is mostly in liquidated assets or like the jewelry, which remains with a girl her
So
entire life, and even she also inherited some of like the gold jewelry from her mother-in-law, and also like she passes it down to her daughter-in-law in the future.
well, what I'm asking is because I understand what a dowry is. What I'm saying is, like you just said, it's the girl's inheritance. How is a parents giving their child's inheritance to be managed by their husband an example of misandry?
I don't think he said that it's an example of misandry, but what we're basically
He said
saying.
it was.
And
Okay,
no,
okay.
no, I didn't
Here's
say it
my
was example of misandry. I was just adding on to what Kately said about like the dowry and all.
okay. Okay. Here's my opinion on this. Okay, I'm also Indian, by the way. Half Indian, half Arab. So in our culture, it's the girl who gives the dowry to the guy, or rather, her family gives the dowry to the guy. And the reason why the guy is given the dowry is not rather a gift, but more like because it's kind of giving him a way to support the wife and the kids, right? Which is fine. That's not such a bad thing. The issue is there's kind of some problems stemming out of that, right?
Like,
So, for
yes,
example,
like the husband side of the family really like exploit or really harass the woman or their wife, or the wife side of the family for more money. Like this has been like a really big problem in India for like centuries now. If not centuries, at least many decades.
my only issue is that people, they usually, especially radical feminists, again, not criticizing all feminists, but just some of them, they say that, like, in Arab culture now it's the opposite. It's the guy giving dowry to the girl. They say that's an example of people objectifying women or selling women, but when it's done to a guy, they just ignore it, so like pick one or the other is basically what I'm saying. Either dowry is selling someone or it's not. Don't say that, like, when it's given to
You
a guy,
mean
it's
it's
not
done to
selling
a
him,
guy? What do you mean it's done to a guy?
meaning, like, okay, in Arab culture and in some other cultures, it's the guy or the guy's family who has to give dowry to the woman, right? And some people, they say that's an example of people objectifying women or selling women or that kind of thing. But in Indian culture, it's literally the opposite. It's the woman or the woman's family. It's mostly the woman's family who has to give the dowry to the man. Usually she
Right.
doesn't pay for it herself,
Right.
so my only issue is, like, if you say that giving dowry to a woman is an example of misogyny or objectification, then you should also have to say that giving dowry to a man is also objectification, but like they
Not
usually just ignore
necessarily,
that.
because in Indian culture, at least how you describe, where it's the parents of the bride who gives it to the man, you're giving your child's inheritance to a man to manage it. Like you said, to provide for her and the family, when she could have just had her own inheritance and provided for herself. And then in the inverse, where the men are paying the dowry to the parents, it's like you're selling your child for money. So it's like either
This
way
is
you
not
look
the
at
logic,
it.
though.
I mean, I would like to add something here that it's completely wrong, Athena. It's like dowry in traditional sense is mostly women's jewelry that a woman's gonna have with her, and she's also gonna receive jewelry in the form of gold from her future mother-in-law. So it's gonna be with the wife. Uh, yeah, there are some
Well,
communities that
personally,
like
I don't
give.
think that
Guys,
there's
guys,
anything wrong
guys,
with
guys.
either. I don't
This
think there's
is an
anything wrong with
interesting
either.
this
I
is a
don't think
very
there's anything wrong.
interesting topic, but we are getting a little off topic from where we're supposed to be. So if we could just please get back to our
Okay,
37
sorry.
question.
I mean,
Okay.
I would just like to finally say that that even in India there are many communities that in cases that men have to pay dowry, but it's like a gender bias law that protects victims of dowry harassment, which are women, but it does not protect victims of dowry harassment that are men. There are many communities of that where the men have to pay dowry. Like there are many tribes in northeast India are like that. Even in my culture, there is no tradition of dowry. It's like usually more of a gift thing.
Okay. Okay, getting back on topic. True Serial Drill's been asking me to read out this thing saying, just read this, please. White women White women would use false accusations of rape to get black men lynched, and about 95% of rape allegations made against black men on college campuses are false, yet they have the audacity to say allegations aren't an issue. Yeah, that's very true. Okay, so getting back onto the list here, does anyone want to pick a particular question to look at, or are we past the list?
Yeah, I just wanted to say number 14, where it says, can you name one country where men who become fathers are expected not to work or study? Like, this is what? Like, this is so insane that she's giving this as an example of systemic misogyny. when having the option not to work when you become a parent is, I don't know, I mean, like, you could say that it's just my own opinion, but I actually consider that a privilege, you know. But apparently, no, this is an example of misogyny, apparently, you know. And like, it really, like, let me just give you a quote by Simone de Beauvoir when she was talking with Betty Friedan. And then she said that women should not be authorized to have the choice to become stay-at-home moms or housewives because too many women are going to pick that choice, you know. So it really shows me that in a lot of radical feminist minds, the fact that women are choosing to sometimes become stay-at-home moms or housewives, to them that's an example of misogyny somehow, despite the fact that it's literally the woman's choice, right? And the fact that men don't have the choice to stay home with their children, that in some countries they work literally up to 60 hours a week to support their families, that's not an example of systemic misandry. You know, I just, man, like, the logic is just, it doesn't make any sense to me. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what kind of a rock would she have to live under to not know that men who become fathers are generally hyper expected to work? Like, they're expected to support the mother. If she gets divorced from him, even while, you know, she's pregnant with the baby, he's expected to support that baby for 18 years. So if the mother being expected to stay at home with the baby is misogyny, then what is that? You know?
And I'm actually writing a chapter about this in my book, or rather, it's a recurring theme in my book, that men are continuously blamed for women's own actions, and like, they're constantly villainized and vilified, you know, even if a woman is making her own choice. Like, if, for example, in this case, if a woman makes the choice to be a stay-at-home mother or be a stay-at-home wife, it's somehow the evil husband who's just forced her into it, despite the fact that he now has to work extra hard to support her and the children, you know. Like, it's just like, it's like, okay, it might not be systemic, but that's a pretty good example of misandry right there, that she's literally blaming men for that, you know, when most of the time it's the women's, it's the women's own choice, you know. I remember when during the 1930s and the 1940s in the US, you know, things were difficult, right? The economy was just bad, and many women had to work, right? And so there was this kind of emergence in society that, you know, women should become career women, and, you know, they should have all the same jobs as men, you know. Well, not the dirty, dangerous jobs, the comfortable jobs, you know, like CEOs and everything. And then during the 1950s, when the economy was actually much better, it became an option for many middle-class women, and not just really wealthy women, but it also became an option for middle-class women to become housewives. And at that time, it was seen as a privilege to actually be able to stay at home, to be a full-time mom or to be a full-time housewife, sometimes with a like a housekeeper, you know, as well, especially if you're like upper middle class or wealthy, right? So at that time it was seen as a privilege, but now the 1950s is seen as like the peak of misogyny, you know, despite the fact that it was literally women's own choice to do that, you know. So like, I just really think that there is this kind of element of just blaming men all the time, even when they actually do something good for women, you know. It's, I don't even know what to call that.
Sandri?
Okay, yeah, it definitely is.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. Like, these, the feminist theories were saying that being a stay-at-home mum is like super like oppressive, and it's this patriarchy attacking women, which just shows you that the theory itself was actually made by a stay-at-home middle-class woman who didn't have to work, which is what happened, because working class women had to work. Like, they didn't work as much as the men, but they worked. They'd be washerwomen, they'd work in factories sometimes, they'd work on the farm, they'd work in all sorts of things. It's actually a myth started by feminists that women didn't work prior to like the 1940s. Like, they just didn't work the same jobs as men. Like, they'd do more delicate things. Like, I mean, it's weird. Everyone remembers the Fosse girls, who like, they got Fosse jaw from working in I think it was a paint factory in the Victorian era. I'm not sure the exact dates, but like, it was a whole thing, and the feminists go on about it, and like, yeah, it's this tragic thing that happened to these women who just wanted to work in a job. And yeah, that sort of thing happened to men all the time. Like, the first paint factories, the men went insane because of the fumes and things like that.
I think the thing to look at with that too is, I think they acknowledge some work done before the 1940s and 1914 stuff. For example, in the UK and other countries hit by the Industrial Revolution, they started having a lot of these like sort of factory jobs of just working with yarn machines, working on early production line. And before that, there was like a lot of farm work to be done by the women as well, and like families of lower economic positions, poorer families. And they acknowledge those jobs exist and how horrible it is. I think what they don't acknowledge in that situation is the fact that a lot of those people and families in poor situations or lower economic stances during those times, every single family member was working, the man, the woman, children. And it was usually the male children and the man that took on the more dangerous and harder position. Although it was still dangerous sometimes to work in like yarn factories, some of the children would be working in mines as well as husbands, depending on the kind of mine.
Here's an interesting one, another one from the list. Can you name one country in the world where a man is not recognized as a whole person before the court and therefore cannot give evidence in a trial unless it's backed by a woman who is deemed to be a whole person? That's number 28. And again, they're talking about Islamic countries. But the interesting thing here is that in the UK and America and so on, in like Title IX rape trials and things like that, the woman's word is the only thing that counts. Like, period.
Yeah. Oh my God. Title IX is so terribly written. Oh, probably shouldn't be saying that out loud. It's just written in such a discriminatory way. It's absolutely absurd. I mean, there is loophole upon loophole upon loophole to make it impossible, or practically impossible, for men to enact Title IX in their defense, no matter how much they want to claim it's equal. There are a few things they actually can do with Title IX, but not many.
I would just like to say another point. If you go to question 33, it says, can you name one country where men are not allowed to serve in the military? This is insane. Like, she actually thinks being drafted, forced against your will, like in some countries, literally boys as young as 14, like in the Taliban, they're literally forced, some as young as 12. Like, the Taliban literally go around and this is true, by the way. They literally go to houses and they ask, do you have 2 or more sons? If you say yes, they'll take one son and they'll turn him into a cannon fodder, and she's actually using this as an example of misogyny. Like, I am so done. Like, now misogyny is literally men not wanting women to die. Like, oh, the horror. What? Oh my god. What? Like, does this person actually understand what misogyny is?
I don't think
Oh
so.
I'd
my
like
God.
her to name one country where women willingly chose to put themselves on the draft without arguing in the courts against being put on the drafts beforehand, or just willingly put themselves for conscription. Please answer me that.
A big example of systemic misandry is that over 60 countries in the world have mandatory military service for men, and there are only 9 countries that have mandatory military service for women. And I haven't checked all of those 9 countries, but just to give you one example, in Israel, that has mandatory service for women. For the women, it's only 2 years, but for men, it's 2.5 years. So it's literally half a year more for men. Second of all, women can simply say that they're pregnant, or they can say due to religious reasons, I'm not joining. It never even says what they mean by religious reasons, but they just say religious reasons, I'm not joining. That doesn't happen for men. Of course, men can't get pregnant, but they don't have the ability to say for religious reasons, I can't join. Because, in the Torah, in the Bible, it has many examples of men going to war, right?
I think
So
the other
men
thing you
don't
have to
get
look
that.
at. Sorry, Kate.
But I also would like to add to that law is that there's actually even worse in other countries, because I know Switzerland also have a male-only draft, right? And that could last for over a decade, right? But if you are disabled or too tall, then the military doesn't want you, right? Because the equipment aren't available if you're if you're too tall, and they don't want you if you're disabled. But because you're a man, you still have a military draft obligations. That means you have to pay a male-only military draft taxation because the military doesn't want you, but women don't have to do that, and that's even a worse example than Israel.
Yeah,
but you are, despite the statement you made about Israel being completely accurate.
Yeah, I think another thing I'm going to point out, North Korea. I remember seeing so many articles about people talking about women having to be conscripted in North Korea. What people don't realize is conscription is absolutely mandatory to men. But the conscription for women is called selective conscription.
It just makes no sense to me that for some reason some radical feminists hold the military up, as this really big, huge privilege boys club that women are just not allowed into, But let's be honest, it's not like they want women to be drafted either. I don't see any big celebration from feminists when the US now, some people in the US said that they wanted women to be drafted. I don't even know if that law is going to actually pass or anything, but I just haven't seen it anywhere. No one's saying it's a good thing or anything like that. No radical feminist is saying, yay, now we finally have equality. It's like, at this point, it just seems like they just kind of want a reason to complain rather than actually, be happy about anything, And then, when she talks about number 34, which is about university education, I would just like to make a quick point about this, right? In most countries in the world right now, okay, I don't know if it's most, but in many countries in the world right now, especially in the Western countries and in the Middle East, women are actually going to university at much higher rates than men are, right? And there was a country, one Western country, I think it was Sweden, if I'm not wrong, they actually had a law some years ago, which said that the universities must accept a certain number of students per gender, right? So they wanted it to be equal because at that time the number was a little bit lower for women, right? But now it's the opposite, that there are more women going to university than men. So you know what they did? They said it's unfair to women that some of them are being excluded to make space for men. So we're going to remove that law. Like, What?
They also kept it. They also kept it for like other parts of society that women were not dominating in. They only like removed it just for that one, just for the only reason that it was female, more women who were able to. And like, and I think that's like unjustifiable, right? And if you look to like, but I'm actually going to make something sound a little bit less severe. Is that, at least based on my experience, like getting into a Swedish university isn't like very difficult, because I actually have studied in Sweden in the past on university level, and it was kind of easy to get in. So. But it's still, your point is still correct. That's like unjustifiable. But it's even worse in other countries. If you go to United States, right, they have much more scholarship for women only, despite women being the majority in college universities. I think that Christina Hoff-Sommers actually mentioned that a lot of that there are more opportunities held for women to get into university, even though there are more women in universities, right? And I don't know what country this was in, but it was. But it's also a race-based thing, right? Because a lot of countries like South Africa and America have, like South Africa have laws that gives you affirmative action if you are Black, and less so if you're a woman, right? So that's like in that country, it's like the same thing, but with race like added to that. So it's like, it's not, that's in that example, and that goes to America too, actually. So those assemblies, it's not just misandry, but it's also racism.
Yeah, like the part I can't stand about this, on top of it, talking about, saying restricting males and ensuring more women and all of that, I hate that it says deemed more important than men. And I hate that part only in the fact that, at least in Western countries, especially here in the United States, we have a big thing when it comes to our scholarships being based off race and gender. There is a huge amount of scholarships for people of different races, and a huge amount of scholarship for women. There are probably, I don't have an exact statistic, but if I had to take a guess just based off my experience for scholarship searching, there is probably 3 times as many scholarships for women as there is men. And on top of that too, they make it easier for women with children to go to college as well, because they offer scholarships for women who have children go to college, but they won't offer that same kind of scholarship to a man.
Could I just nip in and say that that's actually quite a manipulated stat, in that when they say scholarships for men, they actually mean scholarships that are open for women as well as men, and men can actually like join these scholarships. So what you're saying is that there are a huge chunk of scholarships that are open to women, and then there's a smaller chunk of scholarships which men can also get on.
Well, that as well, counting those scholarships too. There's also, obviously scholarships between both men and women, but I mean, literally scholarships for women only. I found maybe 5 scholarships that were men only. And again, those were divided by like color, race.
Yeah, they probably would mostly be for race, like based on your race.
And then all the women only scholarships, there was like 30, 40 of them. And it was divided between race and different things you want to go into, different organizations, schools, if you have children or not.
Yeah, I'd like to go to number 35. We did post it on the screen, but can you name one country where a man can be given up to 100 lashes for wearing trousers? I think this question is actually emblematic of just how manipulated this question list is. This has to be deliberate, because she has to know that there are countries around the world where a man can get thrown off a rooftop for wearing a dress, or publicly executed, or just beaten to death and murdered, and the authorities not paying any attention to it.
And also for being gay too.
Yeah. I mean, they generally do it because they think the guy's gay, whereas the guy might be trans. But it's it's very emblematic of how this list is constructed. She specifically says trousers in order to exclude men who get way worse for wearing dresses. And I've actually, yeah.
This is, I actually have a point that's even worse. The Taliban, and this is true, they can even beat or even kill a man who doesn't have a beard. Because, yeah, I'm not even joking. Here's the thing. I used to be a Muslim, right? And I have a Muslim family. And in the Muslim, what is called sunnah, which is meaning like imitating the Prophet, he said it's really good, or it's mandatory for a man to grow a beard, and it's not good for him to shave a beard. So the Taliban will literally beat you or kill you if you don't grow a beard. That's 100% true.
But did you also know
I wish I was joking.
No, I believe you 100%, because I also know that the BBC actually found out that that people in Afghanistan, in police or military, I don't know where, in like government entities, were actually raping boys because they thought that would be less of because they thought that's less bad than raping women, right? So therefore they actually did that a lot. And the Western media find out, but they ignore it because it didn't fit their narrative of Afghanistan being this misogynistic country, right? But may I just say one thing? I have to say one thing about Afghanistan that a lot of people don't know, right? That is that in Afghanistan, because of the Sharia, right, men are the only one with obligations to support their wives and the daughters until they get married, right? And sons actually have an obligation to support their mothers if their father dies, which happens a lot in Afghanistan, right? So when people say, oh, we need to make sure girls in Afghanistan have access to education, what they're ignoring is that boys in Afghanistan who don't have education, families will more likely to be without food, while if a woman, she can have whatever job and she will have, because according to the Sharia law that the Taliban now want to implement even further than it already have, that she have no obligations to it. So they basically want to they don't want to address the problem that only men have the obligation for the family. And that is the reason why women in Afghanistan don't get access to a lot of other things. Because if you have a system where only men have the obligation, you need to prioritize men all the time. I'm not saying that this is. I think it's wrong.
What came first, the chicken or the egg? Because you're saying, oh well, men have the obligation to do work because, like that's their role in the culture. So obviously that's going to put pressure on them. But it's like, well, if women could get jobs themselves, they would nullify the need for men to do that. So it's like they both play into each other in a loop.
Yes, I agree with you on that. That's true.
Of course.
But I just
what? Yeah, sorry.
It's also important to add to this. It's actually kind of important thing, and that is that if a woman in those countries actually have the right to work, like the thing is that if a woman works, that means that she's not obligated to support her family. So if she wants to spend all her money on things for only herself, and her children don't have enough food, right? That means that the man will be legally responsible for his children suffering, even though the woman could have supported them.
So, like, drastically hypothetical, because you're already operating under, oh, well, if she could work, I'm sure the laws would adjust like a ripple effect. It wouldn't be just one thing and then still maintain that she had no obligation to her children. Like if that was the case that miraculously women could work, I'm sure it would also be the case that by extension they would be expected to support their children, especially if they have a father that's deceased, etc.
Yeah.
Okay. What I wanted to say is that like we're not saying that it's not bad for them to say that women shouldn't work. No, we're not saying that at all. We understand that's horrible, right? And we definitely support women working, but we're just trying to say also consider the effect that this kind of thing has on men, and not just write silly articles like this person has done. Oh, there's no misandry, because of this and this. I'm just saying consider both sides, first of all. Second of all, we actually do know what would happen. Why? Because if you actually look at the laws of the US and the UK prior to the 1930s, 40s, you see what the law actually used to say is that even if a woman is really wealthy, even if she is like a CEO or a millionaire heiress and everything, she's not obliged to support her husband if he's sick, if he's poor, if he's disabled. But if the husband is poor, sick, disabled, whatever, he actually has to support her no matter what. And he goes to jail if he doesn't support her. There were even letters that men in prison who were jailed for non-support, which was the word used, non-support, asking their wives to at least let them out for the holiday because they were in jail for so long for non-support. That's the first thing. The second thing is, there was a lot of laws. If you actually read about, they were like totally biased, and this was like in the 1910s and 1920s and prior to that. Like, for example, a man, if the woman had any debts even before marrying him, he would be liable to pay those debts after they got married, and if he couldn't, prison, or some other punishment, right? And if she committed a crime that led to her being fined, including even hitting him, if she got a fine for hitting him, he would have to pay that fine. These things have actually happened before. So like when we're saying them, we're not just thinking like making stuff up. This all has actually happened before,
Yeah, and we also need to, that all that is true, and definitely my point exactly, but I also would like to add that a lot of these things are not just cultural law, it's also law that literally comes from the Sharia. It's part of Sharia law that the thing is that women don't need to support their children, it's the men's obligation to, right? So I am saying that I do support 100% women working, women getting education. Obviously I support that, definitely. I said it's very important that we make it so that we need to have sure that women can also have access to education, but we also, at the same time we do that, we need to make sure that both genders are legally obliged to support their families in an equal fashion. We cannot only look at, we need to make sure women have access to education. That is important, but that's only half of the issue. The other half is that only men have the obligation, and women can still choose, right? Currently, women can actually choose to get an education and work in parts of Afghanistan in the past, and probably as well now, because that is not violated by the Sharia. But according to the Sharia, the woman's money doesn't belong to her family; it belongs to the woman. And so, as long as that is law and not just a social thing, if that's the law, then we need to fix that. We cannot just fix one half. We cannot just fix that women are being discriminated against when it comes to getting education. We need to fix that, and we need to also fix the fact that only men have obligations, because that one-sidedness is not going to solve the problem. If you have both genders being oppressed and you only look at one half and you fix that, and then the other thing goes unnoticed, you're going to have a problem. You're not going to help anyone.
Well, that was my entire point, is that it all coincides with each other. Like it's a thing of, like I said, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Like, it all is a revolving door within itself. So you have to address both aspects of the problem, which was my point initially.
Yes, I agree with that. That is 100% correct. And that is why I think it's so horrible that all these Western governments, they only look at one half and not the other half, and then it's not going to solve anything. So you are correct.
I think to add on to your point real quick, Willie, with obligations, I think another thing too, I'm trying to remember, it was a law I sort of found. I'm not sure if it's entirely true. It's a UK law. Ma, I'll send it to you later. I've already sent it to Mike before. And it's about, it's sort of about parental alienation in a way. It's about police forcefully taking kids and bringing them to the other parent if the parent feels they're getting alienated. And the way it's written, it says the father if he has parental responsibility. And this is very similar to the United States law, where when it comes to divorce cases, a lot of time, they make him obligated for a lot of things within the marriage and supporting the wife and supporting the children. But then they make his role sound replaceable, I guess, to put it, or as if his role can be changed to not responsible for the kids but still obligated to pay for them. Even though he is half of those children, his role can still be changed. I'm trying to find a good way to explain this. It's hard to explain. because the way they have it written is so confusing. Because they call it parental responsibility, but he still has obligations.
Well,
Yeah, it's
I think that a lot of that.
Payment.
I think a lot of. Oh, sorry.
But the way they have it written, they make it sound like his role can change in whatever the way they want to for the upper hand of the other partner, even though he's still obligated, whether or not he supposedly quote unquote has responsibility. I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah, so I think that that is an element of traditional misogyny in the sense of like going back to like traditional ideas of what gender roles should be, and being that women are more better suited to domestic tasks and being in the home, and men are more suited to like being leaders and successfuls and leading the household financially. And then you take those elements and incorporate them into the justice system, and you see how that plays out when ill fit and ill suited mothers are given custody despite how bad they might be as parents, and are often given preference over the father, because it goes back to this deep indoctrinated idea that women, by virtue of being women, are homemakers, and men, by virtue of being men, are protectors and providers. And so you have these people who make these decisions thinking that, oh, naturally, the children should always go with the mother because that's the woman's role. And that's just, to me, in my mind at least, an example of how traditional misogyny backfires when you see how it gets played out in the judicial system, when you see family law, etc.
You know, I hear this example a lot from a lot of people that, you know, every time men have an issue, it's always male privilege or misogyny backfiring, you know. The funny thing is the actual laws about children going to the mother before a certain age, that was actually made by Caroline Norton. You can actually go look this up. She was an American, sorry, not American, sorry, British woman, and you know her husband. You know, this was back in the 1800s when divorce was extremely uncommon, right? She got divorced from her husband, who was an abusive asshole, and he took the kids, and then he was like, I'm not going to let you see your kids anymore because you divorced me, right? And she found that obviously wrong, right? So she went and gave pamphlets to many people in parliament, and then she said it's not right for a woman to not be able to see her kids anymore, even if she's getting divorced. And they were like, you know what, this makes perfect sense. And then they made actually the first pieces of what is called feminist literature. And up till this day, even though Caroline Norton, who was not even actually a feminist, she's been hailed as one of the feminist activists in the 1800s, right? So, and then there was a few more laws, which essentially became the tender years doctrine, which said that kids below a certain age, the laws should prefer the mothers, right? So this thing was actually started by women, not by men, right? And again, I don't 100% have a problem with that, you know, because, you know, especially at that time, you know, it was totally wrong for a guy to say that a woman should not be able to see her kids. I 100% support what she did, you know. So it's not an example of misogyny, you know. Yes, gender roles are restrictive and wrong, but it's not misogyny.
First and foremost, I really don't appreciate my argument being misrepresented, and I don't know if that's intentional or not, but I would like to specify, just for clarification, that I did not say it wasn't women. I did not say it wasn't feminist. I said it's an example of misogyny. Feminists are misogynistic. plenty of the time. A lot of women are misogynistic. And in my mind, misandry and misogyny are an ever revolving yin and yang loop that work intertwined with one another. You can use each term, in my mind, almost interchangeably in a lot of situations, and family law is one of them. I did not at any point say that feminists didn't advocate this or it has anything to do with feminism. I said that this comes from the traditional ideas and ideologies surrounding gender roles, which is misogynistic. And gender roles is often misogynistic. You can call it misandrous as well. They're both working together in this case. And I don't think that any of what you said negates my point. My point was that a lot of the times people hold these traditional values and these ideas of traditional gender roles, and you see how the effects of this plays into family court when ill-suited mothers are given free reign over like parenting and child rearing, and the fathers are disenfranchised in that area. And that's basically the entirety of my point, is that no matter how ill-suited the mother is, she'll often get preference over the father.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to apologize for misrepresenting you. Sorry, that was not my intention. And then second of all, like on the topic of systemic misandry, why wouldn't it just be better to say that this is an example of systemic misandry rather than saying that this is just misogyny backfiring? Because that's what it really looks like to me.
Well, in my mind, I don't really see a fundamental difference between the two. Like, I think that misogyny implies that women's roles are confined to a specific set of guidelines. And a lot of those guidelines have to do with being homemakers, being parents, in less to do with being the active provider and producer and head of the household. So misandry in my mind is more just discriminatory actions against men, which obviously this is an example of that, which is why I say it could be both. But when I say misogyny, it's because it's specifically holding this idea of women's roles always need to be mothers and to be nurturers, despite all evidence in a lot of these court cases suggesting the complete opposite, which is why I'm saying it's an example of that idea backfiring, because when you put the onus onto women that they are inherently and naturally better suited for child rearing and child raising, it hurts everybody, because when that's not the case, the child ends up in a bad situation. The husband or ex-husband, whatever the case may be, ends up in a bad situation, and it's not healthy for anyone. So that's why I chose that particular framing of it, because it really has a lot to do with gender roles, in addition to the discriminatory acts against the men in the situation.
Yeah, like I think all that is like definitely correct, but I will say that I don't think having gender roles is like inherently a bad thing. But I think it's a bad thing to have gender roles mandated and forced upon people without their consent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I can agree with that.
It's like a lot of people like to have sex, right? No problem, but if people would force it on other people, then that's a huge problem. Maybe a weird analogy, but you get my point.
Yeah, that's kind of where I see the difference between, like, kind of how we kind of touched on earlier, is the difference between systemic and cultural. Like, there's nothing wrong. Well, that's debatable, but in my personal view, I don't see that much wrong with having cultural ideas of sex and gender, and people who choose to perform their gender and people who choose not to, I mean, whatever the case may be. But when it comes to a systemic level and those ideas are enforced to a degree that makes it so rigid for people to like receive justice that they deserve, then I think that's when it becomes very problematic.
Yeah, that makes sense to me at least. Like, if it's like forced, then it's terrible, and if it's like voluntary, it's like it's just consenting people. Like, yeah, that makes sense. If I want to like structure my family in this way, then and if my partner consents, then that's fine. But if somebody wants to force, violate my rights, like in regards to how I can structure my family, then that's a huge, massive problem, especially when it regards to gender, which it very often is.
Well, a lot of the problems is that the laws that are surrounding these types of things were at a point very necessary and very needed. And like how Kate was saying that a lot of these things were enacted by feminists in the past, it's because in the past it was feminist, whereas now it's kind of flipped and become the opposite of that. Because if you look at something like what's it called, spousal support, something like spousal support back when women could not work was very progressive and feminist, because if you're come out of high school and you go straight married and you start having children, and you in the entire 15 years you've been with your partner, you've been raising your children, and you've acquired no working skills, you acquired no, you have no resume, you have no nothing. Guess what's going to happen when your spouse leaves you and you have children? You're going to probably have issues with supporting your children. And so it makes sense when you have things like child support and spousal support when in a situation where women could not work and women were disenfranchised in that region. Whereas now women are working. Women have no issue finding jobs. Most women work. Most women I know in society work. So those types of ideas are now antiquated, where at once upon a time, those were needed and necessary. So it's just about like the laws need to catch up to the current reality of the times. And that's when those, ideas start to become very misandric and discriminatory against men, because they're no longer relevant, but they're still being implemented as though they are.
Like, I would say that there would have been a solution to these problems if we didn't have no-fault divorce, because I would say that no-fault divorce is what enabled men in the past to divorce their wives when she had done nothing wrong, and then leave her without a resume in the situation you just listed, right? And therefore, I believe that fixing divorce law by ending no-fault divorce to a certain extent would actually help both genders a lot. And I can go more into detail, but I think maybe whoever is hosting this wants to move on to the next question. I just wanted to say that.
What I find interesting about one of the questions is that if you go to number 2, it talks about terrorist groups abducting boys and trafficking them for sex, right? Now we have a really good example of this, and it's Boko Haram, when they literally kidnapped 10,000 boys or over 10,000 boys, and no one cared at all. No one said anything. And they would go to schools and kill all the male students, even setting some of them on fire, and they would spare the female students. Again, no one said anything. But 300 girls were kidnapped by Boko Haram, and some of them were even released, but everyone was just going insane. They were like, hashtag bring back our girls, like Michelle Obama even was holding up that sign, which I support 100%, but why did they not talk about the 10,000 boys? Like, they're roughly the same age, and they might not be used for sex, although some of them might, but they're being used as cannon fodder. You know, it's no better to take a young boy and, you know, use him as a child soldier than it is to take a young girl and subject her to a lot of torture, you know, which is
and last Christmas they went and they kidnapped another 200-300 boys. A few escaped, but the rest I don't think have been seen again. And there's no outcry. Michelle Obama is not making tearful pleas for them to be returned. Nobody's saying anything. And it's also worth noting that during the initial kidnapping, well, not initial because they were doing it for years to boys and they never got any media attention at all. But during the kidnapping, where they took those 200-300 schoolgirls, they killed way more boys. Like Boko Haram's usual tactic before that was to remove all the girls from the school, barricade the boys inside it, and burn it down.
Interesting is that all that is true, and I also like to say that Boko Haram, if people, what my watch doesn't know, is that Boko Haram literally means education is forbidden. And I would also like to add that there were an Islamist attack in northern Mozambique, where a lot of Islamists were killing a lot of men. They would purposely kill only men, right? And then they kidnapped some women and children who were not old enough to be murdered because they were boys, right? But I don't think that age was that high, to be honest, right? And also, and then when that happened, right, and they basically said in the UN, oh, we need to make sure that these terrorists don't manage to kill more women and don't manage to harm more women and girls. And I'm like, so they're literally saying that they just completely ignore the reality, all the male victims, just because they're male, which is monstrous. Absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to post the last two questions because I really have to go very soon. But here they are, and I think they're very interesting. Now, number 36, can you name one country or community where it is illegal for men to own or use a mobile phone? I can name one, Afghanistan. Not specifically because the Taliban went around knocking down the phone towers, but because the American forces before Afghanistan was taken over by the Taliban would go around with drones, and if they saw a man with any kind of device held to his ear, they would shoot him with a missile. And I think that makes it pretty illegal to own any kind of communication device if you're a male in Afghanistan, especially since they didn't do that to women.
Also, don't forget that according to the Taliban, men who are not actually part of the Taliban, okay, not part of the Taliban, but rather like those top officials, you know, like in the Afghanistan, so like a very small number of men. Apart from them, men are not allowed to own phones, TVs. You know, there was the case of a teenage boy. He was, I think, 14, and he was caught watching a Bollywood film, and they took him out and beat him up. You know, I don't think they killed him, but like they beat him up really badly. You know, so the Taliban is just brutal, you know, for everyone, but for some reason they're only focusing on women, you know. So
I'll say that the simple solution, reason why they only focus on the women is because they only care about the women. And I would say that that's just what I see, and yeah, that's why. Don't know how else to say that. That's the same thing we said earlier about the discriminatory laws discriminating against both genders, right? And they only want to address those negative effects on the women and not negative effects on men, because you don't care about them. That's kind of that's it. I think, yeah.
A pretty big example of systemic misandry that we can see from this is that the UN, international governments like the UK and the US, they're saying that they're going to give priority to women and girls, and especially female leaders. And they say it's because women are uniquely targeted by the Taliban, despite the fact that I actually made a post where I was examining a UN report that actually showed that boys are 3 to 4 times more likely to be raped, to be killed, to have their schools destroyed, to be abducted, by these by the Taliban, right? And if you look at the amount of boys that they kidnap for child soldiers, they don't use girls, right? They don't use girls at all. So that's 100% boys, or 99.9% boys, right? And so the thing is, they're not targeting women and girls, right? They're targeting men and boys, right? And if you actually look at what the report says, it confirms everything that I'm saying. They actually show the number of boys and the number of girls, which was really good. It was really good of them. But the most glaring example of this is that there was actually an article that showed that I think it was 70% of the people who had been killed by the Taliban were like fully grown men. And then the 30% was made up of women and children, right? So women were even less likely to be killed than girls, and girls were less likely to get killed than boys. I think the rate of killing boys was double that of girls. But still, the article said, and I quote, women and children are disproportionately affected. Disproportionately. They actually use that word. It's like they don't even know what disproportionate means. Yeah,
well, I would actually say that they're correct in saying that this disproportionately affects girls, because it affects girls disproportionately less than boys, because like if you have less, if they're targeting women less than men, then they are disproportionately targeting women, because if they were proportionately targeting women, they would target them equally to men, but they are discriminating by targeting against men more. So in a way, they're right. They use very deceptive in their language usage, even though it's technically a correct statement.
When you say like disproportionately affected, I mean, I'm not going to argue over linguistics, but when you say disproportionately affected, you mean like more, so like it would be correct to say something like disproportionately unaffected, or men and boys disproportionately affected, but they would rather die than admit that. So
Yeah, but my point is more like it's like, I think it's like technically grammatically correct or linguistically correct to say disproportionately, because it just means out of proportion. It means it could be more or less than what would be proportional. So that's just a semantic thing, but and I believe that they know that people think disproportionately. They assume it's more, right? But it could actually be less, and they do it just so that they can say things that are true, but sounds in a way that make people believe otherwise, if that makes sense.
I will actually just close this point by just saying one last thing. Like, these people, like they have a lot of audacity. Like, do you know that in their article they didn't even give the number of men that were killed? They just said something like 533 people, including this number of women and this number of children. They didn't even bother saying this number of men, like 300 men or something like that have been. They didn't even bother. Like the audacity is a lot.
It's the deceptive language again. Yeah, you're correct.
Hey Ma, I know we're supposed to go to the last point, but I just wanted to bring up something about number 9 real quick, sort of related to it.
I'll go on.
So number 9 is, can you name one female-led country where the child marriage of boys as young as 6 years old to adult women is widely encouraged or legally allowed? I don't know if you addressed this earlier. I was sort of listening to you guys in the car because I was at a meeting earlier.
Like I would say that
go ahead.
Is that if you go to the United States, if a boy is it's like raped by a woman, that he needs to pay all the child support he didn't pay when he was growing up. So that's not married. Like it's like the boys that are raped by women in America would be liable for child support if the rapist wanted that, right? And so no, you wouldn't be forced to get married to a woman when you're a child, but if you have kids when you're a child, that means that the time you spend as your child with piling up child support that you have to repay when you're an adult. So and that's equally bad that's actually just as bad as being forced to marry someone than when you're a kid. I actually would say in a way it's actually worse, because in some countries where they marry off girls when they're children, it's actually legal to consume the marriage until she's an adult. So in a way that's like even worse. Yeah.
Well, actually, child marriage of boys is just as common as for girls. They'll literally marry a boy and a girl who are the same age. Or they'll marry a boy to an older woman. Yeah.
Although Romania is not female-led, they actually have the way they structured the family rules in some of these communities, a decent amount of them, where the man goes to work, but the woman is in charge of setting up the marriage of the child. And there are a lot of cases in those communities where the mother, since she's in charge, will sometimes set up her younger son with a much older woman.
I think you're talking about Armenia, right? I just want to make sure I hear you. Romania. Okay, sorry. So yes. I thought you meant Armenia. Thanks. I just wanted to.
Romania. I think. Yeah, some of the more traditional Romanian gypsy communities still remain where the mother's in charge of setting up the marriage, and she will set up the marriage of her son at the age of like 12 to like a 20-year-old or something. I mean, I understand also in those communities they do wife bride like sell-offs and stuff, but that is another big thing, that they do force marriage of younger boys to adult women.
I would just like to say one thing. Just quickly gonna throw it out that there in the world right now 115 million child grooms. Just a statistic there. It's a non-trivial amount of child grooms, just to say the least. And so yeah, these boys exist. And the second point I'd like to make is that a lot of these underage marriages of girls, a lot of them, they're mostly something like a 17-year-old girl getting married to a 19-year-old man. You know, technically that would be considered a child marriage, you know, of a girl, but like it's totally different than saying a 6-year-old gets married to a 14 or a 40-year-old, you know. So it's, you know, it's a little bit like how do I say, like kind of changing the information, or like kind of spreading misinformation, you know. And yeah.
I don't disagree. Again, just my point was, you know, they will, in those cultures at least, they do have a tendency of women being the ones in charge, the head woman of the family, the mother being in charge of setting up marriage. And I've literally seen videos of like 10-year-old boys being set up with like 17-year-old for marriage, or like 18-year-old girls, 20-year-old girls.
It's interesting that they only ever found out about boys being married off because it was accidental while they were like studying girls being married off. They found that some of them were being married off to boys. So it's, you know, they basically just accidentally stumbled across boys. This, you know, it's just the typical thing. Like boys only get you know, noticed when girls were involved.
Yeah, this one sort of like live documentary where they were following this gypsy family, they didn't find out about this marriage of this 10-year-old boy to a 20-year-old female until but the only reason they found out about it is because they were following the story of her sister going to a bride market. in a bride market, they'll sort of show up at a place and, the guys look at females and the mothers, they try to see who they might be willing to set up with.
All right, and guys, I'm going to cut this stream. So good night to everyone listening on YouTube, and thank you for tuning in. We will be back next week at the same time, Friday, 5 p.m. UK time. That's 11 a.m. Central Time, I think.
11 a.m. Central, 12 p.m. Eastern.
Yeah, thank you. And so, if you have a topic you'd like to suggest, please do. And we will listen to all your suggestions and see which one's the best. Good night, everyone.
Well, wait, before we go. I have one more thing to say. It's very much important before you end the stream. And that is to answer the last question. That is that in the past, if a boy were considered to be homosexual in the Netherlands, he would be castrated. And there were sometimes where priests were actually molesting Catholic priests were molesting boys in the Netherlands, right? And then those boys were castrated because they were convicted of having seduced the priest, even though they were like 14 or 8 years old, these boys. So there is example of boys being considered to be bad and then having their reproductive organs like surgically removed against their will, even though they were actually victims.
Yeah, like the history of units too.
No, there was physical castration of like people who were like teenagers or children because they were being accused of having seduced the priest who were actually molesting them.
There's quite a lot of. Have you ever looked into the German program where they put young boys, like they're orphaned boys, with convicted paedophiles in order to well, I'm not even going to say what their theory was on air, but the guy whose theory it was actually one of these people, and he like designed this theory basically to try and legitimize his sick sort of weird fantasies. Sorry, I have difficulty talking about this, but it's on the citation list if you want to take a look at it. Anyway, good night, everyone, and I'll see you all next week.
If we're still alive, I'm just going to say that a lot of these boys died after being physically castrated.
It's just disgusting. Another example of what we can say of systemic misandry is the fact that throughout history, the vast majority of executions of gay people and persecution of gay people has been directed to gay men, and most of the legislature has been about gay men. And right now there's over 70 countries in the world where it's illegal to be gay if you're a man, and only 40 where it's illegal to be gay if you're a woman. And even those 40 countries, they rarely really ever enforce it. I'm a bisexual woman. I'm in Kenya, where technically it's illegal to be homosexual for any gender, and it's just not enforced for women at all.
No, it's the same with Namibia. It was illegal on the book, but they say they want to make gay marriage legal, so it's also like that's not being enforced either. But I would also like to add, if you say an example, if you go to Denmark, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and France, and Spain, and Portugal, right, it is technically illegal for two gay couples to have kids, but not for lesbians. Male couples.
When you kind of merge LGBT issues into this, it kind of does have there's a lot of intersectionality when we're having these conversations, because first, the reason that a lot of lesbianism isn't as demonized is because a lot of lesbianism and female homosexuality is unfortunately fetishized by men, women, culture. A lot of people don't even view female homosexuality as a real thing to begin with. So it's kind of these topics, once you start veering into like a lot of these LGBT issues, a lot of the reason that people don't pay as much attention to it is because they don't even think of it as a real thing. Like in the way that when men do it, it's just demonized and it's like the worst thing that could ever be. But like even earlier, I think Kate was mentioning how like in some African countries, it's so like male boys or male rape victims will be charged with homosexuality. Like in a lot of the same African countries, like people will be able to rape lesbians to try to cure them of their homosexuality. So I do think like LGBT is kind of like a gray area when you start talking about men's and women's rights, because a lot of biases and a lot of disbelief around how different genders express homosexuality.
Well, but it is very clear cut when it comes to homosexuality and gender when we have countries where it is explicitly not legal for gay couples to have children, but explicitly legal for lesbian couples to have children.
So I'd just like to add on the point about lesbians being raped. Unfortunately, that is true. It's quite sad. However, it is a lot rarer than a gay man, for example, getting killed, right? And also, raping a woman who is a lesbian is absolutely illegal in every single country in Africa. It's just it doesn't
But
they won't even take her sexuality into account, you know.
it's
So
not
but raping men is not. That's the issue.
well, it's not enforced at all, and raping men is illegal, if only to even say like that you're gay because you're raping a man. So like both of these issues are technically illegal and they're just not enforced. I mean, I'm sorry. It's technically illegal to rape women. It's just not enforced in terms of like lesbian women, and it's technically illegal to express homosexuality in the form of raping men because that, you know, it's sex with a man. So it's both are legal, have legal things surrounding them. It's just not really enforced because LGBT issues in a lot of countries are dismissed and treated under the rug. And if it affects you, and even if the laws support you, the society won't support you because you are a part of the LGBT community.
But it's still, I mean, like, I'd also like to say I used to have to say a very concrete example of how homosexuality is persecuted in some countries by only the one sex, right? If you were a lesbian couple who lived in France or Switzerland, for example, you could legally get a sperm donor, right? And then you can have kids together, and then you can raise them as a couple, and then you get all the tax benefits, and mostly men pay anyway, right? But if a gay male couple, they are not legally allowed to hire a surrogate to have their kids, and if they decide to do this in another country, then they will be then that they will be punished for going back to their own country if they want to raise their children there, right? So therefore, that's a country where it's illegal for a gay couple to reproduce, right, if they are men, but supported by the state if they are lesbian couple.
Well, this is why I say a lot of these issues do come down to intersectionality, because if you look at the reason why a lot of issues surrounding like adoption and sperm donation and things and the differences between women and men is because going back to what I was arguing earlier, is women are inherently seen as better caregivers, providers for like motherhood, all that nonsense. And men, especially gay men and LGBT men, are viewed as predators. And you see this all the time with discrimination against like gender inclusive bathrooms, against like even back when gay marriage and like gay people were trying to adopt, people explicitly had a problem with men doing it under the guise of that they would be child predators. So in my mind, like a lot of the discrimination that is happening with men in these arenas does come back down to the fact that they are LGBTQ, and that's where a lot of the problems are stemming from, because of the social notions that demonize gay men and put them into the box of being predators.
Well, this might be a little bit hot take, but I usually would say that calling these issues LGBT issues might actually be sort of like contributing to an issue. And what I mean by that is that people have used the idea of arguing for transitioning children, right? And under the guise of trans rights, even though a lot of trans people wouldn't support that, right? And if we say LGBT rather than when something is just about people being homosexual, then you're like having a connection between those that could actually harm. And if you are opposed to, which we are, the false belief that gay men would be somehow predatory, right? Then making that connection would actually be beneficial for homophobes. Can you also use that connection to argue in favor of homophobic legislation?
Okay, I'm like kind of confused. Can you like say that part again? Like the last?
Oh yeah. Some people are saying that they are using they are trying to argue for the children, right, should be allowed to transition, right, when they're really young, right? And if they do that under the guise of LGBT, right, then they are sort of using people who are gay as like, and also trans people, but they are also using people who are gay as like a shield, right? And then the term LGBT sort of associates a false association that doesn't really exist, right? So therefore, if you have a connection between LGB and T, right, which isn't really real, then you can then people who are homophobic will use the connection. Oh, but look, these people who want children to transition are similar to people who are just gay, which is very, very wrong, and that just doesn't benefit people who are gay in general.
This is sort of on topic, but on topic and a little bit of a hot take from both your point of views. I mean, you guys are saying this. I'm sort of just listening in. I think when you were talking earlier, about like gender neutral bathrooms and gender neutral changing rooms, like the whole worry about predators and stuff. I think a part of that has to do, as you were talking about stereotypes earlier, stereotypes with men in general. Because, I know a big hot take recently in the news has been about this spa that allows people to choose what what changing room they want to go into. And so this trans man to woman went in there, but they aren't going through, the procedure you go through for, to take away, the procedure you go through within that.
Sex change surgery.
Yeah, sex change surgery, and they aren't also doing the sorry, I feel horrible for being uneducated. Like I know the words are not coming to my mind right now, but when you put like estrogen in your body, you become a woman slowly, or like the other way around, when you put testosterone more in your body, you become a man slowly. And so they were going through that.
Hormone therapy.
Hormone therapy, thank you. But so that person wasn't going through that, but they still identify that way, and they walked in there with like a dress on, just change, and they were like, "Oh my god, it's terrible. There could be predators and stuff." And on one hand, yes, they're having gay predators, they're having male predators, but we are making that a stereotype of men in general, and so that affects then all men, whether it be trans men, men who are trying to identify as something else, men that are women, trans men or men to women, trans women that aren't doing those kind of changes, or just trans men who actually look like men, and so forth and so on.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, it's a stereotype people should argue against. But my main concern is that when people are arguing, they are using the guise of the trans moniker to argue in favor of like of things that are really harmful for children, right? The